Ezekiel Thornfield hadn't always been a coward. There was a time, not long ago, when he'd worn a badge with pride, believed in justice, believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. But that belief shattered one bloody afternoon in Deadwood Creek. He'd fired in pursuit of outlaws, righteous in his fury, convinced of his mission. But when the dust cleared, it wasn't the criminals who lay dead. It was a family, a father, a mother, and a little girl named Catherine, and a 12-year-old child, Sarah Morrison, left sobbing behind an overturned wagon. He hadn't just pulled a trigger that day. He'd destroyed something sacred. And when the truth came crashing down, Ezekiel did what so many men do when they can't face themselves. He ran, changed his name, bought a ranch in the middle of nowhere, tried to bury the past beneath cattle, whiskey, and silence. But the dead don't stay buried. Not when the living refuse to forget. Now, standing on that porch, rifle in hand, surrounded by warriors and ghosts alike, Ezekiel realized something that hit harder than any bullet. He had become the kind of man he once swore to stop. A man who hides, a man who justifies, a man who lets the innocent pay for the mistakes of the powerful. The woman stepping off that stagecoach wasn't Catherine Morrison. Catherine was already in the ground, because of him. The woman before him was Sarah, grown and hardened by years of grief and quiet fury. And she hadn't come for revenge. She'd come for truth, for justice. She wanted him to look her in the eyes and remember, not just what he did, but what he failed to do. Own it. Ezekiel felt shame rise like bile in his throat. All the letters, all the dreams of starting over, they were never real. They were a mirror Sarah held up, showing him exactly who he was, a man running from the worst version of himself. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to die that man. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't bring Catherine back or erase the blood from his hands. But he could choose now, choose to stop running, choose to help Sarah finish what he should have finished long ago. Not for forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, but for redemption, the kind you earn, not ask for. So when he pinned that old badge back onto his chest, it wasn't pride he felt. It was weight, a heavy, sobering weight, the weight of memory, the weight of responsibility, and maybe the beginning of atonement. The war drums had stopped, but the silence they left behind was louder than any sound Ezekiel Thornfield had ever heard. He stood on his porch, rifle trembling in his grip, heart pounding like a hammer inside his chest. Before him, no more than 50 yards away, a young Kiowa warrior sat calmly atop his horse, bearing a white flag and a name that hadn't been spoken to Ezekiel in over 3 years. "Sheriff Thornfield," the young man called. The title struck Ezekiel like a slap to the face. He hadn't heard that name since the massacre at Deadwood Creek, the day his past stopped being something behind him and became a scar etched into everything he touched. He thought he'd buried it, thought the Colorado wilderness, the long days of ranch work, the isolation, would wash away the blood. But now, that name was back, carried by a warrior who knew far too much. And behind that warrior, up on every ridge and canyon wall, were over 400 armed Kiowa, watching, waiting. But they weren't here for a raid. They were here because of one woman. Catherine Morrison, or at least the woman Ezekiel thought was Catherine, was scheduled to arrive in just 2 hours. He'd read her letters for months, clung to them like a drowning man to driftwood. She was supposed to be his second chance, a new beginning, someone to build a future with. But she wasn't real. The real Catherine had died of fever in Kansas City. The woman coming now was Sarah Morrison, the 12-year-old girl who had once screamed over the bodies of her dead family as Ezekiel and his posse misfired justice into a trading post full of innocents. That girl had grown into a woman of steel and vengeance, and she was coming not to love Ezekiel Thornfield, but to destroy him. Every detail of her plan unfolded like a slow knife across his conscience. The fake letters, the staged romance, the war party, not there to kill, but to witness. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. His past wasn't buried. It had simply been waiting, and now it had a face, a name, a voice. As he stared down the warrior and the invisible line between guilt and reckoning, Ezekiel felt a storm rise inside him. Shame, rage, confusion. But deeper than all of it was clarity. This wasn't a trap, it was a mirror. He was about to come face to face with the girl he failed and the man he used to be. He could run. The creek bed on the eastern edge of the property still offered a narrow escape. But what would that change? He'd already run once. He'd already chosen silence over accountability, and that choice had birthed 400 warriors, a woman bent on truth, and a reckoning 3 years in the making. Ezekiel looked at the young brave, then toward the trail where the stagecoach would arrive. The sun was hot on his neck. The air smelled of gun oil and dust. His hands trembled, not from fear of death, but from the weight of truth. He couldn't undo the past, but he could face it. Maybe that was the only power left to a man like him. He stepped off the porch and set his rifle down. "Tell her," he said quietly to the warrior, "that I'll be here when she arrives, that I'll listen." The brave nodded once, and just like that, the lines were drawn, not with bullets, but with courage. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop running. The truth doesn't come with a scream. It arrives in silence, like a ghost from the past placing a hand on your shoulder, forcing you to turn around and look it in the eye. For Ezekiel Thornfield, that truth came in the shape of a small wooden box, a yellowed document, and a voice he had hoped never to hear again. Sarah Morrison, the daughter of the family he had shattered with a single misjudged order. For 3 years, Ezekiel had lived like a stranger to his own past. He had changed his name, left behind the badge, and buried his conscience in a river outside Deadwood Creek. He told himself he was just a rancher now, a quiet man living a quiet life in the most isolated valley in Colorado Territory. But peace built on lies isn't peace at all. Sarah wasn't Catherine. She hadn't come to build a future, she came to dig up the past. She had orchestrated a masterful illusion, tender letters, loving promises, dreams of marriage and a fresh start, all of it designed to make Ezekiel believe he was worthy of love again. But the entire performance had only one purpose, to lure him to this moment, at this place, where escape was no longer possible. And then she tore off the final mask with a truth as cold as death. Catherine Morrison had died weeks ago. The woman standing in front of Ezekiel was her younger sister, the same girl who had watched her family bleed to death from behind an overturned wagon. Ezekiel stood frozen, not because Sarah was angry, he had expected that, but because she was calm. In her eyes was not just rage, but something far more terrifying. Clarity. "You've been running too long," those eyes said. "Now, it's time to stop." And what was the truth? That he had given the order to fire too soon, chasing the wrong men. That he had turned away from the consequences. That when he realized what had happened, when he saw 3 innocent bodies lying cold in the dust, he hadn't stayed to make it right. He had fled. Worse, he had abandoned the real criminals, the Garrett gang, allowing them to vanish and keep killing for 3 more years. And the worst part? He had convinced himself it was noble to leave, that walking away was penance. But Sarah didn't let him hide behind that lie anymore. She handed him the proof, arrest warrants, intelligence from Kiowa scouts, names of new victims. She told him about the next target, a train full of orphan children, scheduled to arrive in 4 days. 43 children, defenseless, hopeful, unaware that they were walking into a slaughter. And then she asked him one question. "Will you keep running, or will you finally do the right thing?" Truth is a dull blade. It doesn't slice fast. It carves slowly, peeling away the layers of justification, denial, and cowardice. Ezekiel had no more excuses. Everything Sarah said was true. Every detail, every name, every innocent death. His silence had helped bury them. The truth broke him. But then, it rebuilt him. He walked into his cabin, pulled out an old coffee tin, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was the sheriff's badge he'd sworn to never wear again. But in this moment, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about image. It was about something more powerful than either. Accountability. When he stepped back outside with that badge pinned to his shirt, Ezekiel Thornfield was not a man seeking forgiveness. He was a man who had finally accepted that truth demands action, not guilt, not shame, action. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her job wasn't to forgive. Her job was to make sure he remembered. By confronting him with the truth, she hadn't just brought him to justice. She had handed him a chance to make justice mean something again. To take everything he had run from and aim it in the right direction for once. He wouldn't get redemption. He didn't expect it. But he would get a second chance to do right. And sometimes, the truth, no matter how brutal, is the only way back to becoming the man you should have been all along. The setting sun stretched long shadows across Cedar Canyon as Ezekiel Thornfield cinched his saddle for the last time. The breeze was dry, carrying the scent of mesquite and dust, and something else, something like purpose. It had been 3 years since he'd fled Deadwood Creek. 3 years of silence, of pretending to be someone else. But now, with a weathered badge pinned to his chest and a rifle strapped across his back, he was no longer hiding. He was riding into the storm he should have faced long ago. Sarah Morrison stood beside him, her jaw tight, eyes set toward the trail ahead. Gone was the mask of the lonely bride. What remained was the steel of a woman who had clawed her way through grief, shaped her pain into purpose, and hunted justice down like it owed her breath. Beside her were the Kiowa warriors, over 100 strong, war paint faded by wind but not resolve. These were men who had once surrounded Ezekiel's cabin, ready to take his life. Now they would ride beside him to save others. It was an alliance no one could have predicted. A disgraced former sheriff, a vengeance-driven woman, and a war party forged by centuries of betrayal. But something bound them together, something more than revenge. Responsibility. For Ezekiel, it had taken seeing Sarah's pain up close, hearing the quiet rage in her voice, to finally confront the wreckage he'd left behind. It wasn't just about the Morrisons. It wasn't just about his own guilt. It was about the future, the children on that train, those innocent souls headed west with dreams in their eyes, completely unaware that the Garrett gang planned to steal it all away. He had failed once. He would not fail again. The ride to Millfield would be long and dangerous. Hostile terrain, settlements that would shoot first and ask why a white man rode beside a Kiowa later. But for once, Ezekiel didn't care about appearances. His life had been one long act of image preservation. Badges, titles, reputation. Now the only thing that mattered was the mission. They rode in silence for miles, hooves kicking up clouds along the dry trail. Every so often Sarah would glance at Ezekiel, not with warmth, but with wary trust. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't here for that. But she believed now that he was ready to act, that he might finally become the man she needed him to be 3 years ago. Running Elk, the Kiowa chief, rode beside them with quiet command. His people had also known loss, children taken, villages burned. They rode not just for this train, but for every child who had vanished into the system and never returned. They weren't mercenaries. They were guardians of memory, of legacy, of lives stolen by injustice. And in the middle of it all was Ezekiel, no longer the lawman, not quite the outlaw, just a man trying to make the weight of his sins mean something. Every mile they covered was a step toward redemption, not in name, not in ceremony, but in deed. At night, when the fires were low and the stars burned overhead, Ezekiel would sit alone. He'd feel the cold press of the badge against his chest and wonder what it meant anymore. He had once sworn to uphold the law, but the law hadn't protected the Morrison family. The law had looked the other way when Kiowa intelligence warned of the Garrett gang's next strike. This mission, this strange, desperate coalition, was not bound by law. It was bound by a deeper code, a shared vow that the innocent would no longer suffer for the mistakes of the powerful. Sarah once said, "You don't deserve forgiveness, Ezekiel, but those children deserve someone who won't run this time." And that's exactly what he planned to be. No more running, no more hiding behind titles or shame. Just action, just fire and steel and conviction. The kind of man who would ride straight into hell to stop the very evil he once failed to see. As the moon rose over the canyon and the group pressed forward, Ezekiel Thornfield wasn't thinking about whether he would survive. He was thinking about 43 children, about a train, about a second chance he'd never expected. And for the first time in years, his heart was still. Because now, finally, he was doing what he should have done all along. Dawn broke over Millfield Station like a warning shot, blood-red and merciless. The train was late by 7 minutes. That was 7 minutes too long. Ezekiel Thornfield stood with his back against the water tower, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes locked on the dusty horizon. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with purpose. The kind of purpose that came when you'd run from something for too long and finally turned to face it. Beside him, Sarah Morrison adjusted the scope on her rifle. Her jaw was set like stone, her body coiled like a spring. She wasn't just ready to fight. She was ready to finish what began 3 years ago. Behind them, over 30 Kiowa warriors crouched silently in the brush and atop freight crates, blending with the earth like ghosts of vengeance past. They needed no speeches, no orders. They understood what was at stake. 43 children, unarmed, innocent, forgotten by the world. Not today. Across the open plain, dust plumes rose, evidence of riders approaching fast. The Garrett Gang. 30 men, just like the intel said. Armed to the teeth and driven by greed. They thought this station would be easy pickings. No lawmen for miles, just a lonely stop with a strongbox full of cash and a train full of witnesses. They had no idea they were riding into hell. Ezekiel's fingers flexed against the grip of his Winchester. The old badge on his chest gleamed dully in the morning light, scratched, weathered, but real. He hadn't worn it in years. Now it felt like a second skin. The whistle of the train pierced the silence. There it was, crawling along the track like a steel promise, 30 tons of iron and innocence, carrying 43 lives toward a future that almost never came. Sarah took a deep breath. "Wait for my signal," she whispered. The riders crested the ridge, dirty, cocky, guns drawn. The trap was set. As the Garrett Gang began to fan out, ready to box in the train and rush the station, Sarah raised her rifle and fired the first shot. It hit the lead rider square in the chest. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the morning air. Kiowa war cries split the sky as the warriors burst from cover like thunder. Ezekiel moved like a man reborn, fast, deliberate, unflinching. Every shot he took dropped another outlaw. Every move was fueled by 3 years of guilt turned to fire. The Garrett Gang hadn't expected resistance. They definitely hadn't expected coordination between a woman with nothing left to lose, a disgraced sheriff with everything to prove, and a war party with centuries of rage in their blood. One by one, the outlaws fell. Still, the battle was brutal. Smoke swallowed the platform. Fire licked the edge of the station house. Sarah took a bullet to the shoulder, but didn't stop shooting. Ezekiel tackled 2 men trying to reach the train cars. In the distance, Running Elk rode in like a god of war, his warriors flanking him on both sides, sweeping the gang back with terrifying force. By the time the dust settled, only 5 of the Garrett Gang were left alive. The rest lay broken across the battlefield. Ezekiel stood over one of the survivors, panting, rifle lowered. "This is what justice looks like," he said through gritted teeth. "Not some noose in the dark, not a lawman hiding behind paperwork. This, right here." Behind him, the children peeked out from the train windows, wide-eyed but unharmed. One little girl waved timidly. Sarah saw it and smiled through the pain. They had done it. They had saved them. But this wasn't just a victory. It was redemption. It was the moment when history bent toward something better. Not just because they fought, but because they fought together. Kiowa, settler, sheriff, survivor. All once broken, all once bitter, all now standing as one. As the sun climbed higher and the battlefield cooled, Ezekiel looked around and felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace. Not the kind written in treaties, the kind earned in blood. And for the first time, he wasn't running from his past. He had faced it, fought through it. And this time, the innocent lived. In the shadows of past mistakes, there still lies the chance to do what's right. That's the core message behind the powerful and emotional story of Ezekiel Thornfield, a former sheriff whose reckless actions led to tragedy, but who ultimately stood up, faced his past, and chose to fight for the innocent. This isn't just a tale of redemption. It's a reminder that every person has a second chance, if they have the courage to confront the truth and take action, even if it's late. Ezekiel couldn't undo what happened in Deadwood Creek, but when he stood in the middle of that canyon, surrounded by guilt, warriors, and a woman scarred by his past, he didn't run. He stayed. And because of that choice, 43 children were saved, and a fragile bond of trust formed between people who once stood on opposite sides of history. In today's world, many of us carry the weight of things we wish we could change: mistakes, regrets, missed chances. But like Ezekiel showed us, redemption isn't found in apology alone. It's found in action. When you choose to take responsibility, when you stand for what's right, no matter how hard, that's when healing begins. Another powerful lesson in this story is that true change happens when people from different backgrounds, different colors, cultures, and histories come together for something bigger than themselves. Sarah Morrison, driven by grief and justice, could have chosen revenge, but instead, she led the man who once ruined her life toward redemption. That's the strength of purpose and forgiveness, not to erase pain, but to transform it into meaning. And the Kiowa warriors, led by Running Elk, they weren't just symbols of resistance. They were voices long ignored, indigenous protectors fighting to save lives, not take them. In this story, they weren't just allies. They were leaders in truth, showing us that justice has many faces, and often, the ones least listened to carry the deepest wisdom. If this story moved something inside you, a belief in second chances, the power of courage, or the hope that people can still change, don't forget to hit subscribe. On our channel, you'll find more than just tales of the Wild West. You'll discover real human stories of honor, sacrifice, redemption, and the timeless struggle to do the right thing in a brutal world. Subscribe now to follow more unforgettable journeys of bravery, justice, and healing across the American frontier. Let these powerful stories remind us all that the past may shape us, but it doesn't have to define us.